little disagreement, which I suppose Jared may say is because of my Australian background. I disagree with my colleagues as students disagree with their professors, as he mentioned. It's true that Australia is in some sense individualistic, but I think in very different ways from the United States, and rather less so, even though we're a wheat-growing country and even though our population is not at all dense. And yes, we do get quite a few Nobel Prizes in research and are quite innovative, but there are various ways in which we do things that Americans would not. For example, perhaps most obviously, we have compulsory voting. If you don't vote in an election in Australia, you will get fined unless you have some legitimate excuse for not having done that. It's hard to imagine Americans accepting that. Also, in the case of COVID, we had very strict COVID lockdowns. I think Melbourne had the city in which I spent the COVID pandemic lockdown period in Australia and in Melbourne. We had 210 days in which we were locked down in the sense of only being able to leave home in order to buy essential supplies. And if we did leave home, there were various stages of lockdown. We were restricted to a 5-kilometre radius from our home. So we accepted a great deal of restriction that American lockdowns did not accept. And generally those were well observed. There was some police enforcement, but I think they were well observed by a spirit of, yes, we're all in this together. We need to cooperate. And as a result of that, incidentally, we have, on current statistics, a far lower death rate from COVID than the United States. We have somewhere between 500 to 600 COVID deaths per million. The United States has over 3,000 COVID deaths per million. And in fact, our rates are quite similar to that of South Korea, and not that different from other cooperative rice-growing countries like Japan. So, and I think we don't really share the US ideas about individual rights being sacrosanct in the same way that the United States do. And I would say that whereas Jared Diamond has suggested largely geographical reasons for the differences, I would like to suggest cultural and historic differences play a role here. A big difference is that the United States had to wage a war of independence against George III and the British government, and whom they regarded as a tyrant. And they did this on the basis of an appeal to John Locke's philosophical tradition, which does emphasize rights against the government and the idea of individual rights against the government. Australia never had to fight for independence. We received independence from Great Britain, a gradual series of steps, which, in some respects, is still not quite complete, since we acknowledge the Queen of England, or the King of England as it now is, I must correct myself, as the King of Australia too. In terms of political power, of course, we are completely independent. Also, I think, in contrast to taking our philosophy from John Locke, Australia was much more influenced by the philosophy of Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, because there were political radicals in England in the early 19th century where that was an offence, and a number of them were transported as convicts to Australia. Australia was then a place where Britain dumped some of its convicts, and some of those political activists, I think, who were influenced by Bentham and some social theories around Bentham, came to Australia and influenced our cultural traditions. So I think that history and culture do play quite a significant role in terms of the extent to which countries are independent or not independent, and also the extent to which countries regard government as potentially tyrants and therefore want small government. We don't want small government in the way that Americans do. We have, for example, a national healthcare system which covers everybody, which the United States does not have. As some people in the United States have struggled to get it, but so far without real success. So having made those comments on what Jared Diamond said specifically, I do entirely agree with him that in the world that we're in now, we need to cooperate. We need to cooperate internationally. It's urgent that we cooperate on climate change in particular, because climate change we have seen just in the last year is getting worse, with more extreme climate events like the floods in Pakistan, and we've just been having serious floods in Australia too. The world is getting warmer. We're breaking temperature records. So we urgently need to cooperate on this. And it's difficult to do because the world is still divided into different nations. And this is certainly an area in which we really need more cooperation. But I also want to say that I think we need more than just cooperation. We need more altruism on the part of those who already have a lot. The world is divided into rich and poor nations. And to say that these nations should cooperate suggests that it's going to be an exchange, mutual cooperation for mutual benefit. Well, it's harder for people in extremely poor countries, or for those countries themselves, to actually benefit affluent countries like the United States or Australia or the wealthier European nations. So I think we have to move beyond that. We have to encourage altruistic practices. That is, we have to encourage the idea that we should live so not only to do good for ourselves, not only to do good for our country, but to try to make the entire world a better place. And this is what the effective altruism movement, in which, as you kindly mentioned in our introduction, I've played a role, is trying to do. It's trying to encourage people to see that living for the purpose of helping others is, in fact, a good thing to do ethically, and also does not really involve much sacrifice. It may involve some small material sacrifices, but it's also psychologically rewarding. It gives us a sense of purpose to live so that we can benefit others and know that we are making a difference. And the effective altruism movement is trying to encourage people to do this, and also to do it effectively, to use our resources, whether we have money we can donate to charities to help people in low-income countries, or to combat climate change for that matter, or whether we have time and energy and skills to put into that. We want to get the most good that we can out of those resources. And that's why the effective altruism movement, including a particular organization that I have founded and, as was mentioned, donated to, called The Life You Can Save, we are trying to encourage people to do that and to show them which are the organizations that have been independently assessed as being most effective in helping people in extreme poverty. Because we can make a difference, we should be making a difference, and I think increasingly more and more young people are seeing that that is something that they genuinely want to do. They genuinely want to live, not only to enrich themselves, but also to feel that they have done some good in the world. Of course, for those who are struggling to feed themselves and their families, that's not really possible. They can be good neighbours to each other, perhaps. They can cooperate among themselves, and they indeed may because of the mutual need. But it's not really going to be enough to produce a world in which extreme poverty has been reduced and, I hope, ultimately almost eliminated. The Sustainable Development Goals suggest eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. I have to say that, unfortunately, we're not really making enough progress to achieve that. But I do hope that we can get back on track now that the pandemic appears to be ebbing, we can get back on track to continue the reduction in extreme poverty that the world saw during the decades before the pandemic hit.